All right, so welcome to the In Cayman podcast. I'm here with Andrew De Rossi. How you doing, man?
Doing well. Thanks, Badir, for having me on. Glad we could finally connect.
Yeah, me too. You're the first person I'm having on the podcast that's not in Cayman, so that's exciting.
Well, not for me. I kind of wish I was there.
Yeah, one day you'll be here, man. I'm sure. I'm
Cool. I'm
sure.
stuck in Pennsylvania for now.
Right, right. So, and today I'm excited because we're going to talk about, well, those who know me well, one of my favorite topics ever, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And first, first off the bat, I noticed that you say his name different than I do. How do you say his name?
So I was taught that it's Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So there's a silent L in the Teilhard, but that's how I was taught to pronounce it. So I'm not French. I don't have any French in me, so I don't know that I'm doing it justice. But you could ask a French person, to say it much more eloquently.
Right, right. Huh. So tell me, when did you first discover Pierre Teilhard de Chardin?
So I discovered Teilhard when I was doing my master's degree. I was at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, and I was just knew I wanted to study something more in terms of getting out of grad school, and was really kind of hungry for more knowledge in terms of spirituality, theology, philosophy, that type of thing. But I found that no matter which smattering of courses I would take, it was never really satisfactory for my rather synthetic way of thinking. I'm, rather interdisciplinary type thinker and person, and just have my hands in a lot of pots and a lot of irons and fires, with a lot of different projects and like different ways my brain goes at times. So I naturally struggled to find someone who could, in some way, kind of put into words that I believed in, my internal theology, so to speak. So it was during that time that I eventually, met a professor who would then become a mentor and friend, who I ran the name by. I was like, "Hey, have you ever heard of this guy, Pierre Teilhard?" And he's like, "Yes, and he's your guy, and you need to read him." So I first read The Phenomenon of Man, and from there, that was, pretty much the beginning of this journey that we've been on together now. So I eventually went on to get a doctoral degree where I really honed in on Teilhard. And I did write my master's thesis on his Phenomenon of Man, but I really honed in on him and his work when it comes to lending some material that we can use to integrate spirituality and psychology, which is really what I focused for my doctoral dissertation. So stayed with him through my doctoral dissertation, and now I'm just involved professionally and personally in a lot of ways, like with the American Teilhard Association, for example. I'm a board member there, and we do a lot of work together.
Ah, cool. You're a board member there. I didn't know that. I've been to some of their meetings that they have out in New York. Huh.
Yeah, so I think the last meeting we had may have been, I forget if it was like 2017 or 2018, maybe, that met in Manhattan. And then the next year there was a conference in conjunction what the organization, what is now known as the Center for Christogenesis, and that was at Chestnut Hill. And then 2020 happened with COVID. And since then, we've really just gone virtual with a lot of our programs. But we gathered for the first time as an official event last October in Hyde Park, New York, and we met at the gravesite, Teilhard's gravesite, for
Cool.
a celebration of his 100th anniversary of the Mass on the World that he wrote. I think you want to talk a little bit about that
Right,
later.
right.
But yeah, then we're going to be gathering again this coming June, in Pennsylvania. We're going to be having another gathering. We're going to have great discussions and small group stuff. So
Super.
we're making that shift back towards in-person programming. I mean, it's been a great gift to be able to reach so many people globally with Zoom. Like, we have a lot of people that participate from Australia, believe it or not, in our programs, although we are the American Tarot
Right,
Association.
right.
But it's really a goal of mine, at least personally, and on other board members too, to get back to in-person meetings, because there's nothing like that exchange of energy physically.
For sure, for sure. Although it's not against Taylor to meet via Zoom, right? For those of us who know his thought, but no,
Yep.
I mean I'm not from America as well, but I definitely have gone to a lot of those. I think maybe at least three of those meetings for the American Tail Art Association. I know there used to be a British Tail Art Association. I don't know if there still is, but that never quite had, I think, the traction that the American Association had. And no, I find it interesting because you said, you were searching for like someone who is like interdisciplinary And Teilhard is definitely very interdisciplinary because I find so many people who are into him are really, they come from outside of theology, right?
Yeah.
And some of them aren't even believers, but they just gravitate to his thought from all these different realms. So that's super fascinating. So
Yeah, his vision just calls you to that larger sense of participation, larger sense of being. And that in itself is really what is very spiritual about it, right? It's not necessarily that he was a Catholic Christian and that he uses this language of like Christ Omega, but really it's this sense of participation and a sense of collective being that we're called towards. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scientists that are interested in his work because his work is grounded in science.
yeah, it's fascinating. So I'm wondering, can you give us a quick sort of um understanding of his vision for those who just aren't aware of Teilhard de Chardin? Can you sum it up? I mean, I know that's not maybe easy to do, but in a way, can you just sum that up for those of us who don't know who Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is?
Okay, so let's see how I do here in like
Yeah,
2 minutes or less, maybe. So Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a French Jesuit priest and paleontologist. He had his PhD in paleontology, and he was born in 1881, died in 1955. He was born in France and died in the United States in New York. And he led a very Renaissance person type life. He was a stretcher bearer in World War I for the French army. He did a lot of field experience and field study in the East, in China specifically, but also in other locations around the world. He was a part of a major evolutionary discovery at the time in terms of the Peking man. And then he would go on really to have this vision that was deeply inspired by his time in the war. As traumatic as that was for him, it really was quite a catalyst for his imagination and for his spirituality to really bloom beyond the container of the faith that he was raised with. He never went against that. He just came to embody a faith that was much more, and I use this word very holistically, but very radical, very dynamic, and really took him to the fullest sense of the word of Catholic, which, the word Catholic with a capital C implies an institution, right? It implies the Catholic Church, the Roman
right,
Catholic Church, as oxymoronic as that is, because the word Catholic means universal. So
right.
it's kind of saying like jumbo shrimp, right? We're calling it a Roman Catholic Church or a Roman Universal Church. What? So he really embodied that word Catholic in my eyes in a lowercase c in terms of a universal faith. And what's so universal about it is, like I said, it's grounded in science, where Teilhard understood that there are these two components of like a similar force working in the world, working in nature, working through evolution, and they are complexity and consciousness. And they're really like two sides of the same coin, because every time there is an increase in the material complexity of the world, there is an increase in its consciousness or its inner awareness, so to speak.
Right,
So the chief example of this that we have right now is us, the human person, right? We are the most complex thing known to science, shy of a quantum computing system. The human prefrontal neocortex is the most densely ramified piece of equipment known to science. And this is all sitting behind our eyelids, right?
right,
So we are obviously a very complex organism. Our body is made up of all sorts of different cells and bacteria and viruses. Our gut alone, I believe, has more, there's more bacteria in our gut than there are cells in our body.
mhm,
So we are an incredibly complex organism, an incredibly complex machine system, if you will. And therefore, in that complexity, we have this capacity to be highly conscious. We are so conscious that we are self-aware. We know that we know, or at least we can know that we know, right? And in that, the human person, says Teilhard, is a phenomenon. We are not like the ultimate phenomenon of the universe, but we are the current phenomenon, the most leading edge of evolution that is allowing not just humanity, but consciousness through the vessel of the human to encounter this larger sense of being that we experience the more evolution evolves, so to speak. So I don't want to say too much more. I wanted to keep it at a brief description as you requested, but I'll leave it to you to ask any other questions for where you want to go with
But
this.
let's stay with that a bit, and can you talk a little bit about the evolutionary process in terms of complexity and consciousness? Because just now you spoke about the human, but
Mhm.
presumably there's other examples of complexity consciousness, right, along the evolutionary timeline. Can you discuss that a bit?
Sure. So we can go all the way back to that moment of creation, that incendiary moment, the great flaring forth, which is typically known as the Big Bang, right? And in that moment of the Big Bang, we could say that there is a very low level of complexity. There's swarming of electrons and stuff like that. I'm not the scientist to really explain in accuracy what's happening, but we can surmise that there is very little happening complexity wise. Therefore, there is very little happening consciousness wise, right? It's a
Right.
very unconscious process, if you will. And it's then through billions of years that this process becomes more and more conscious to the point of reaching the human person, whereby then we can be, like I said, self aware of not only ourselves, but ourselves in relationship to other people, the planet, especially, and then even beyond that in terms of the divine and the transcendent. So yeah, I mean, we could go back to the most basic level of matter in terms of like our Earth and our geosphere, right? And we can say that to some really, minuscule level, the rocks and the dusts and just all the little pieces and bits of Earth have a degree of consciousness. And Teilhard says this because there is something materially that's holding them together. There is a force of attraction that's bringing them together. And that is this internal sense of awareness, says Teilhard. So he has two words for this, right? He says there is a within of things and a without of things.
Mm,
And the without of things is more of that material complexity of matter, so to speak. And then the within is the state of awareness, the more of a sense of being. So, we as human people have there's a great it's easy to see, right, in human people. Yet if you think of a rock, you're like, well, how is this thing conscious, right?
mm,
Well,
mhm,
okay, let's go somewhere in between. Let's substitute like a plant, or
mhm,
let's go even a little bit more in an animal or something like that. Like surely an animal has, an awareness to it. A
mhm,
chicken's gonna do what a chicken's gonna do, a dog's gonna dog, right?
mhm, mhm,
But a plant's gonna plant, but humans don't necessarily human that well.
mhm.
Individually, we seem really can't have, we didn't really figure it out yet, and collectively, we're sure struggling on that level too. So that's where we really, I think make room for the theology within this because, we get something from Teilhard that we don't see in a lot of other Catholic theology, and we see more within like Orthodox theology, and that's
Mhm,
really the move, the Spirit, and
mhm,
how the Spirit animates matter, going back to that example from scripture where you have the Blessed Virgin being animated by the Spirit so as to materialize and give birth the Son of God in that story is how it goes, right?
right.
So that's what we are kind of called to do now is become self-aware to the point where we can embody that great cosmic spirit, that spirit of the earth, as Teilhard called it, through the form of human energy, right? It's not animal energy, it's not the energy of the rocks or the stars anymore. It's now the human. Because if you think about it, we can tap all those types of energy. We've already figured out atomic energy. It's the kind of thing now where it's like, how do we steer that? Do we steer it towards, use of weaponry, right, in terms of like nuclear energy, or we have the example of aircraft carriers that can power cities with their nuclear reactors and convert salt water into potable drinking water and stuff like that. So, we're at a beautifully complex and chaotic juncture right now, I think.
Yeah, I always love that law of complexity consciousness because it just put order into the evolutionary process because you can just sort of you can examine anything by that law. And like you were talking about, rocks or stones, there's a low level of complexity there in terms of like the atoms and the molecules that form the rock. So presumably there's a low level of consciousness there. And even there's a lot of Eastern mystics who do believe in the power of rocks. And there's like, some yoga type practices where they use rocks, and I can even feel sometimes myself when I hold a rock, like there's something in there, right? And then if you move up sort of that evolutionary timeline towards like lower level organisms and plants, there's more complexity um, in the matter than there is in rocks, and there's more consciousness, right? So, and then the more throughout time the that evolution complexifies, the more consciousness comes about. And I always find it very interesting that there's a sort of value that is attached to the consciousness because, like, if you kill a fly, people don't have a problem with that. But if you kill, say, a dolphin, then there's major problems with that. And I think why is that? What's the difference between a fly and a dolphin? And I think it's the law of complexity consciousness, right? A fly is just way less complex as an organism and it's way less conscious. So you can sort of kill that without any sort of like, moral dilemma. But a
Mhm.
dolphin is very complex materially and very conscious. So we have a big issue with that, right? And it's like, the same thing with killing a human. So I feel like, that law of complexity consciousness is just so it just puts order to the evolutionary process. And throughout my life, I've always tried to, like, argue with my agnostic friends about this law of complexity consciousness throughout evolution. And they sort of always push back and they're like, no, 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 evolution does not have order to it. There's no law of complexity consciousness. And they'll bring up this idea that, when you look at the evolutionary tree, although for sure the main trunk moves along the line of complexity consciousness towards humans, there's these branch outs that happen where evolution sort of, digs itself into a hole where organisms, they kind of reach their limit and it doesn't become any more complex, and it's just sort of responding to environmental stimulus. Is there is there truth to that? I mean, is there can there be both of those things?
Yeah, and I think that there has to be because that's all part of evolution's, and this is Teilhard's word, groping, just continual reaching and yearning and grabbing forward to try and find a root or some sort of foothold to dig into in order to pull itself up to that next level of life. So naturally, it's going to go in some directions that don't end up working out in the long run. They may be short term, beneficial to the organism or the system, but they don't have a sustainable component to it. And I think that's really where we're at in so much of our world right now with so many of our systems, where we're seeing their absolute failure to keep up with evolution's pace, be it that pace is dictated by technology or culture or economics or a combination of all these different facets of our society, right? But we are seeing that these systems have reached their term in so many ways. And like Stafford Beer, the purpose of a system is what it does, not what it says to do, what it does. And now we're seeing that gross failure, unfortunately and fortunately, across the board. Because Teilhard says that, when these diverge, or rather it's this divergence that happens in the tree, right? It kind of fans out, goes in all
Right,
these different directions. It's trying all these different options.
right.
Um, and ultimately, what he says is that divergence has to kind of come back and that fan has to close back in to a point of union because it's really only going to be one way forward. That is, a few ways forward, but then ultimately those few ways start to narrow down even more. And that's where we start to kind of get into the mystical component of tarot, I think, because if we work off the quote, Saint Bonaventure wrote that Christ is the center of the sciences, really meaning that no matter which field you are studying, which path you're on, it's going to take you to that place of awareness, that place of consciousness, we might call it Christ consciousness, whereby there is an understanding of what is holding all things together. And what is holding all things together, according to Teilhard, is this omega point, or is this cosmic Christ. And that is that sense of union and love and depth and relationality that is not just present in the human person and or not just present in that person of Jesus, typically presented as God and human, right? But it's saying that that is present in all facets of reality, God, human, and cosmic. Every quark, every unknown piece of dark matter out there has this sense of union holding it together. And no
Mhm.
matter what field you're coming at it from, it's going to take you to that point of union. Now, is that going to make everyone say that I believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior? Probably not, right? And
Mhm.
I would say I would hope not almost because I think that has a lot of problems to it with that kind of professed belief, right? As
Mhm.
opposed to a lived belief. But when people are living a type of love Christ consciousness, when they are embodying what someone in the East might call like a Buddha awareness, then that is undeniable. It's also what often gets targeted by institutions like the church. They don't like that when someone really starts living the message of Jesus, right? They're often suspect but that's really kind of where Teilhard sees that divergence coming in terms of, we need to try all these paths, but ultimately we need to find what brings us into union. And he says it's not going to be like one task or one cause, one noble cause, let's end world hunger or whatever that brings us into union, but it's going to be this sense of being, this sense of wholeness that we all yearn for and crave, and we all achieve that in different ways. Like for you, you're a filmmaker, and I'm sure that gives you a sense of participation in the cosmic play,
Yeah.
right? It allows you a sense of stitching these cosmic threads of importance and meaning in your own life and how you connect with other people.
Mhm.
For other people, that may be like theology or whatever, like myself, or maybe it's accounting, maybe it's gardening, maybe
Mhm.
it's, child rearing and raising a family or being a grandparent and embracing the changes in your life and the different seasons of it, right? That allow you that sense of connectivity, embodying that sense of love and passion. And that doesn't mean it's all sunshine and rainbows all the time, right? But it's like you have a focus. You know what's going to get you through the struggles that are inevitably part of evolution, says Teilhard. We basically have to suffer. And he's
Mhm.
not like a masochist in that way, just a realist in acknowledging that a lot of evolution's progress comes from chaos, comes from destruction, and comes from the confusion of the current moment that we're in, that we struggle to be conscious of.
Let's talk about that suffering because, throughout the years, as I've tried to talk Taylor to people and about the sort of increase in consciousness, I get a lot of pushback, and the argument is usually, well, obviously we're not becoming more conscious because look at how terrible we are, right? And I think, Taylor, I don't think Taylor saw things that way. Consciousness, I don't think necessarily meant for him good. It could, that high consciousness could also mean bad. And if we take it back like to the rock example, the low level of consciousness in rocks, there's a sort of quality of goodness to that rock just in existence, but it also can decay, right? It can crumble, right? And then when you go up the evolutionary timeline and you reach the biosphere where there's life, there's goodness to the life and freshness and vitality to life, but and it's a higher level of consciousness than the rock. But then that higher level of consciousness means they can die, right? And they can rot, right? And then you move up the timeline to humans, and you have greater complexity and greater consciousness, and we have self-consciousness, and we have love, and we have all these the wonderful, beautiful things about humanity. But of course, on the flip side, we also have that sort of the negative side. We can now actually not only do we die, but we can proactively kill, murder. There's sin, there's jealousy, there's hatred. So how can we look at an increase in consciousness that combines, both those good and bad elements? Does consciousness just mean good qualities?
It means seeing the whole picture as far as I understand it.
Yeah.
Consciousness is not biased. It's not going to take a side. Um, that's not to say it's not moral or doesn't have a morality to it, I would say, because to be aware, ultimately, I would surmise would lead us to those places where we need to ask those certain questions that are of moral nature. Great question. I've never really thought of it that way, actually. So I'm kind of, having the gear spin on the spot, but um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's going to challenge us more than anything to have a larger vision, right? Teilhard says that we must see or perish in order to really have a future, in order to evolve, and that's what consciousness is. It is that larger vision, and so Carl Jung, Swiss psychoanalyst, like I said, my doctoral work was on the integration of spirituality and psychology. Well, Carl Jung says that there is no coming to consciousness without pain.
Right.
For Jung, it's acknowledging that darker part of ourself, what he calls the shadow,
Right.
those less desirable components of our character, right? The part of me that gets angry and the part of me that can be aggressive and whatever, but when I can be in relationship with those things, then I am able to have a greater sense of the whole, have a greater sense of how I can integrate and how I can channel those things that maybe are a necessary part of me, right? Especially as a man, right? In today's world, it's like toxic masculinity or
Right.
whatever they call it.
Right.
But like aggression, assertion, dominance, like they all probably played a role in why my family is still alive today
Right.
in some degrees, right?
Right.
Same thing for you, right? And so like it's a matter of like how we channel these things, how we are able to use them in a more conscious way. So, it's about conscious suffering, right? It's
Mhm.
about how we not just acknowledge it, but then also take action toward it in order to, in some way, liberate that. So, for Teilhard, there are two factors that inhibit the growth of consciousness and complexity, therefore, and they're injustice and isolation.
Mm.
So injustice, speaks for itself. But isolation, it's like, all right, well, it's not just the tribe in the Amazon that's never been contacted and has never heard of the good news of the gospel or something.
Mm.
No, no, they're good. They probably have a more symbiotic relationship with this planet than the majority of the Catholic Church or whatever, the Pope himself. But it's no, it's isolation that we experience when we experience separateness, right?
Mhm.
When we don't think we have a vital place and part within the larger cosmic play, when we don't think we have an importance within a community or a team or a family or a system or something like that, right? That's really the separateness that I think Teilhard is talking about when we're talking about the inhibition of the growth of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to something yesterday where whoever was saying, there's the power to do good, and then there's the power to do bad. And what is the common denominator? It's power between those both things. And he was basically arguing you cannot do good unless you can do bad. So I really like the Carl Jung analogy because of integrating the shadow.
Mhm.
I really think people are today especially don't they tend to suppress the shadow. They don't want to talk about, these things. Let's just sort of ignore them. Where I don't think that is the right approach. I think it's definitely, has to be integrated a bit more. And I always think about that story when Christ was driven into the wilderness and the devil came at him, and I always kind of interpreted it as this was his shadow,
Mm.
where what were the temptations were. One of them was just bow before me and I'll give you the whole world, I'll give you all the nations. And I feel like that was Christ realizing his power, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously he had so much power that he was able to, revolutionize the world. And he realized at that point, I could take over this whole world if I wanted. I'm that powerful. So it's like, he's tackling, his shadow there, and the other elements of how Satan tempted him. And so I think that is really an important part
And
of.
that's and so so important you point that out because that's how Teilhard's faith worked, right? It took him into this deeper level of immersion within these symbols, within these characters from scripture and so forth and so on, because it wasn't just like a professed belief of like these are these the bullet points of what I believe, and I check the boxes and I do the things daily that make me a good believer. No, he really immersed himself in the murk of it. And I mean, we don't need to get into it now, but he faced a lot of backlash from the church and even from his own religious order. But I mean, if you want to go back to his own religious order, he was a Jesuit. He was a member of the Society of Jesus. It was
Mhm.
founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And Ignatius gives us this great spiritual tool in terms of using our spiritual imagination and using this tip or this gift of Ignatian meditation and imagination, where we put ourselves in Scripture. We put ourselves, at the Nativity or at the crucifixion or on the road to Emmaus, and in deep meditation, we find that maybe we are taking on the character of the observer of watching Christ get put on the cross. Maybe we're the Roman soldier hammering the nail in.
Mhm.
Maybe we're Jesus up there ourselves. Maybe we're one of the thieves to his right or left. Like, And really, that's, I mean, in my mind, that's how you practice healthy religion, is you really allow yourself to enter into these movements that are myth on one level, right? Yet there's also the acknowledgement that historically they happen. And in Teilhard's mind, this is what really tied the science together, was to say that, look, if this guy went through this, if God himself denied his own existence and saying, Father, why have you forsaken me? Like, you are God and you're denying yourself, right? Goes into hell, goes through that whole process of death, dying, coming out. That's something that the entire human person, the entire human organism can enter into as well, in terms of a transformative process and an alchemizing process to turn us into something more conscious, more complex, and really help us evolve, right?
Mm.
Otherwise, we just kind of like keep spinning in circles in so many ways and argue about politics and, what was on TV last night and who won the game. And
Hmm.
all those things are fine, but really it's about tapping into kind of some of these deeper things.
Yeah, Taylor wrote some good stuff on suffering. Did you ever read? I can't remember what it was, but it was about his sister. I think it was at maybe his sister's funeral. And it was just like, like the sermon or whatever. Did you ever read that one? And his sister, I guess she was very sickly and she spent most of her life in bed. Whereas, as we know, Taylor traveled the world, he was all across China and he was doing all these awesome, amazing things. And he was sort of comparing his life against hers, and then ultimately came to the conclusion that he wasn't sure who had the greater life, even though she spent most of her time in bed suffering. It's very fascinating work. Uh,
Yeah, he was so motivated by her because even though she was, just largely inhibited in so many ways, she was really able to take an active role in, advocating for other people who had illness and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, he kind of saw her experience of consciousness as something that he would never have the opportunity to experience,
right.
and that the way she lived out her calling or faith or whatever you want to call it, the way she lived out her humanness and her human experience was something that was in some ways envious for him.
Yeah. So I want to go back to evolution and I want to talk about the noosphere, but I want to
Okay.
talk about the journey to the noosphere because, again, this is sort of looking at evolution from the beginning to where we are now. It's
Mhm.
following the law of complexity consciousness, where, you got the Big Bang, and then over time, matter complexifies, and you got the geosphere, which is the rock formations of the Earth, and then over time, matter continues to complexify upon itself, and eventually it reaches a critical threshold of consciousness, and it lapses into the biosphere, right?
Mhm.
Which is plant, animal life, it's life actually on the Earth. So you have the transition from the geosphere to the biosphere. And then, of course, you got millions and millions of years of the biosphere. And then you have, matter continually complexifying upon itself and also diverging into all these different animals. But eventually it reaches the critical threshold of what he calls the noosphere. So you have the geosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere. And of course, with the noosphere, he means us, humans. So
Mhm.
whereas the biosphere was conscious life, now it sort of evolved, and when it became human, it became self-conscious life. So we're in this
Mhm.
sort of noosphere. So for those who don't know what the noosphere is, could you help? What are your thoughts really on what the noosphere is and how we can see that?
Sure. So we get so the word noosphere, Noosphere, comes from the Greek word for mind, Nous, I believe is the proper Greek spelling for it.
Right.
But really, what this is that as you're talking about these different layers of evolution, right? There's the core and the mantle and all that, in terms of those initial spheres. And then you have the geosphere, then the biosphere, and then you have the noosphere, which is the layer of mind. This is the evolutionary layer of mind. And this is shown on more rudimentary levels in terms of social structures like ant colonies or like beehives, right? There is a social structure there. There is a queen, and there are different roles that the different people play or different parts play within that. And then there are, more advanced forms of socialization working their way up to the human person, right? The noosphere is this layer of mind that is expressed on its most cutting edge in terms of the human person. It's can be evidenced through, first of all, just through communication. It's really a non-biological layer of evolution.
Hmm.
So that's another way to look at it too. We're
Hmm.
not communicating biophysically. We are now communicating using air that we're pushing through our lungs and vocal cords. It's vibrating. It's coming out as these sounds. Our internal dictionaries are matching up these sounds and their meanings, and we're coming enough to a consensus conclusion that we can have a functional conversation and communicate, right?
Hmm.
Because that's happening on other levels too, like just wake up in the morning, listen to the birds chirping, something
Hmm.
like that, right?
Hmm.
So it's not the same level of conscious communication, but it is a level of conscious interaction in that way. Then we get to more advanced form, or not advanced forms, and maybe more advanced examples of the noosphere, such as the internet, right? These are two prime examples that Teilhard gave where you could really tell that we're evolving in terms of the evolution of the noosphere are the internet, which he said would be global telecommunications,
Right,
which
and
has
he
now become
existed. He existed before the internet. For those who aren't aware, which we find very
right.
interesting because so much of what he talked about sounded like the internet. But keep going.
And a lot of people, yeah, they call him like a prophet of the internet.
Right,
But
right,
so the internet and global travel,
right,
which as someone, living outside the United States, I know you were just here pretty locally to me actually and recently for some work you were doing. So, I have a wife and kids now, so I don't get to travel as much. But in my earlier life, I was jet setting quite a bit. So, it's very easy to just book a flight on your phone, a few swipes, it's already linked up with your bank account and everything. And before you know it, you're swiping again to get an Uber, go to the airport, and within hours you're in a new country or something, right?
right, right.
The seamlessness and the frictionless of this connectivity is just dissipating even more to make this even easier to connect. Not that that's without its consequences, right? I don't know that our consciousness is really at the level where we can process this degree of connectivity that we have,
Mhm.
but it's certainly an interesting situation to be in terms of recognizing it, at least.
Yeah, I love that you said it's non-biological evolution. I mean, I never thought of it quite like that, but I think you're right. I mean, even this conversation over Zoom for me is an
Yeah,
example of that noosphere, the communication, the dialogue, the information in the internet, the knowledge, all of that is sort of growing. And again, to follow the law of complexity consciousness, it's like the more humans organize themselves on the globe, the more complex they become in their organization, the more consciousness will grow. And I think we're definitely experiencing that as the human race, and I think it's threatening almost to us how much awareness and knowledge is sort of growing, because to take it back to the power to do good or evil, where we realize that with all of this consciousness we could do power for good, but we have the power to do bad as well. So
right.
it's very threatening, but it's also very evident, this noosphere. And so then talk about the last phase for Teilhard, how we went from the critical threshold between the geosphere, the biosphere, and then the biosphere and the noosphere. What is this critical threshold in the future that he talks about that the noosphere is going to pass through? You mentioned it earlier. I'll make a point.
Yeah, right. So there is another sphere, and he calls it the theosphere, the Christosphere. You could also call it the deosphere. There's an implication there of some sort of divinity to it, right? Theo
Right,
or Dio or Christo. But this next level of evolution is simultaneously what he's referring to as the omega point at the same time, right? So you have the omega point, which is that prime point of this is the ultimate point, not prime, ultimate point of complexity and consciousness in the known universe.
right,
So someone like Ray Kurzweil refers to something of this like the singularity.
right,
For Taylor, this is far more inclusive. It's not happening in and through technology. Technology probably will be a vital part of our connectivity. We've
right.
already established that. But it's really a matter of us connecting on the level of the heart.
Hmm.
So he has this great quote. It's in The Future of Man, where he says that it is no longer a head to head or a hand to hand that we need, and he uses the French, but it is now a heart to heart. in
Hmm.
order for humanity to come together, right? It's more about philosophizing and trying to dialogue on these high levels, and it's more about just like, all right, well, let's just roll up our sleeves and let's duke it out, let's fight it out, or let's just get to work and just start doing the work and do the project and build the thing or whatever. It's like, no, you need to learn to connect to yourselves on the level of the heart. Both first, you and I individually need to learn to connect that way personally with ourselves and with the people in our lives. And then it's our task to connect with others in that way too, in terms of, those that we don't see eye to eye with, those that we are challenged to be in relationship with,
Hmm.
and the situations that have been traumatized and damaged and broken in so many ways, like being they relationships, interpersonal relationships, be they internecine relationships between nations and things like that, or even more universal relationships, like the relationship with humanity and the planet, and the way that collectively we are in relationship with, or not so much with, our planet, and how that has come to impact the human psyche, right? So yeah, I mean, this omega point is this really, it's like a total union in love. So it's not going to be beyond our minds, and or rather, it's not going to be against anything of the mind and of rationality, but it's beyond that. So it doesn't forget our minds and our bodies, but it includes them, and it goes to take up the heart as well, which of course we're not talking about an organ, but something that is more in the terms of the soul, the psyche, the spirit, and really that concept of love, where all those things can be held together in union.
I love that. And I've spent some time researching Kurzweil and his singularity, and a lot of people are aware of that concept. A lot of people actually believe in that concept. A lot of people can envision a future where something happens and we're sort of like propelled. But I've
There's
always
a big industry behind Kurzweil too, I'll say that, and a lot of those wearables and implantables and things like that. There's big
right.
industry behind that. So
Right. And I get it. And I guess I've just always felt that, I like it. I like the fact that he talks about the singularity because it's close to the omega point, but I just always felt it just lacked the substance that Taylor's omega point has. The universal consequence of the omega point, how it includes the whole universe, the geosphere, biosphere, and noosphere, whereas Kurzweil is more technological, as you said, so it's sort of, just a little bit more shallow than the Wake Point. I wish people were more aware of Taylor's version of this critical threshold in the future, as opposed to Ray Kurzweil, who I believe is still alive.
no, I don't know how marketable Teilhard's idea is in that way.
Yeah,
But well,
it's
here's the thing, right? Here's the thing to think about. And I know like there have been architects that have done cool stuff with Teilhard's philosophy in mind, is that if you really are to start to work towards more integral systems, more integrated systems that are actually stacked upon one another. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept and practice of permaculture at all, but like permanent agriculture.
mm,
But it's basically stacking a lot of systems on top of one another so that you don't have to do all that much work.
mm,
And really, like some advanced models, it gets to the point where all you need to do is harvest. You don't need to water, you don't need to seed, you don't need to do anything like that. But really, it's, like I said, those are incredibly advanced models of this practice. And I think that if we are to move towards a more integrated, mindset of our own psyches personally, and then the collective human psyche, and then especially in relationship with the planet, we can start to see a lot of amazing synergy, if that
yeah.
makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I always sort of look for ways to implement Taylor's system in my life or in my films and just in general. So I think that's interesting that you said that architects sort of have that concept. I'd love to learn a bit more about that.
And
Um,
maybe this is the point where we can bring it up, but like, one of Teilhard's core tenets in terms of his process is decentralization,
right, right,
right? Where he sees that first it's going to be a natural centralization of our systems and ourselves. Then we
right.
kind of move to the point of getting beyond that central point of just a focus on, one centralized system, or rather kind of like my ego in that way. If you want to look at it in terms of myself, we go beyond the self in terms of we fall in love, or we start doing service or something like that. We find a way to get out of ourself. And then eventually he says that we move into a hyper centralized or a super centralized state of consciousness. And that's where we all start to see where the big picture and how this all fits together. So it's like, we were talking earlier about Bitcoin
Hmm.
and how this is a decentralized form of value. And, it's an instrumental step in the dismantling of a system that was intentionally broken for rather selfish purposes.
Hmm.
And now we're seeing a much more, a personal, I was going to say democratized, but it's really a more personalized way of, taking back stores of value and how we
Hmm.
exchange that value between each other without the imposition of unjust taxes and things like that. But no, it's more about, how we take a personalized agency within this process, and it's less, just given over to whoever. Like I was kind of having this thought yesterday where it used to be a big deal if you like signed up. And I'm a child of like AOL in the 90s and all that. So like it
Hmm.
used to be a big deal if you had to like make an account for a website. I got a username and a password, and I got to write this down and keep this somewhere.
Right,
Now
right,
it's like anything I go onto it, I have to make a username and a password or log in with Facebook or use your Google account or
right,
whatever.
right.
And it's becoming rather depersonalized in that
Yeah,
way, where before I just felt special. Oh, I
right,
just joined the forum on a video game and I made
right.
this cool username, right? Now it's become quite depersonalized in that way. Um,
Yeah,
but
I agree. It's almost like, why do I need to have another username? Like, isn't there a universal username yet? It's just, and there is
why
this.
do I need to download an app to pay a parking meter to park my car for an hour or whatever? I can't
That
just put the
right?
money. Now I got to download an app to pay it. It's maddening.
Yeah, huh. There's a lot of talk in that sort of Bitcoin space nowadays. I was just listening to a podcast the other day about digital IDs and sort of being able to come up because on Twitter you have like I can't remember, maybe it's the blue check or whatever check it is, and Instagram has, I think it's a blue check as well, and all these checks, and sort of the purpose of the checks is to say that you are who you are. This is who this person is, right? They
Right.
got the check. And I feel like there's a lot of talk now about a digital ID and digital keys and something that works cross-platform where you can, basically say you can confirm that you are who you say you are because you have the keys that sort of sign off on this. So I
Hmm.
agree. I think there's so much friction in the social media world, in the internet world, on the usernames and the passwords. I mean, you should see my Excel sheet with all my usernames and passwords. It's a little ridiculous. You got to think that there's a simpler way there. So, yeah, it's funny with decentralization. Talking about Teilhard, and he's a very centralizing concept in terms of the critical thresholds and also omega point. But like I was telling you, I had a hard time sort of squaring this new decentralization idea that has taken hold of me, and I'm like, okay, sort of we understand now that we got to move away from these centralized forces to more decentralized forces. And how does that help bring us together still though, right? Like sort of
Hmm.
just battling between that. And I don't know, I find it very fascinating that we are where we are now in terms of the internet. um
Yeah, it's hard to like telescope out and go to the more panned out view of things where you can really look at things in relation to the last few decades even. How old are you, Badir?
I am 44.
Okay. So I'm going to be 37, and I mean, so we're right around the same age, and we probably, had similar experiences ish growing up culturally, just to like what we're exposed through the interwebs and on TV and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was
So
on
there is,
AOL.
yeah, and like so you grew up outside the United States?
Yeah, in Cayman.
Yeah, I grew up in the United States. I was born and raised in New Jersey, but there are these unique like commonalities that we have too, despite that. And I think that's what you're talking about, this like this global or you use the word centralizing component to Teilhard's thought. And in that, like, he was a globalist.
Hmm.
I know that word is rather it has interesting implications today, but
Sure.
not a globalist in that sense, but rather, he saw the whole. He was a holist in that way, and he saw that we're a global society, global village, whatever the word is you want to use.
Hmm.
And he was really about getting beyond that sense of nationalism
Hmm.
and seeing that unique sense of like how can we tap this energy of the spirit of the planet and the earth and human energy, therefore how can we convert that energy of the planet, the spirit of the earth he calls it, into human energy, because we are the planet, we are evolution, conscious of itself, able to hurt and harm itself, yet able to forgive itself and to help heal itself and make whole. So that's really what it's all about, is that seeing the whole of it all. And
Yeah, he
part of
had,
that is getting beyond the models that don't work. And that's where decentralization comes in. Like you have to crack eggs to make an omelet. Jesus has to die and rise in order for that whole thing to complete itself.
be broken, yeah.
So suffering is a part of that process.
Yeah, Taylor had that quote, "The age of nations is past. The task before us now, unless we perish, is to build the earth." And
Uh-huh.
it was very much a global thinker. And I think, unfortunately, I don't think we're really there yet. I mean, he was there because he was just so far in the future. I find it fascinating that he studied the past as a paleontologist, but most of his writings were all about the future. It makes
Yep.
sense, right? You know your past, and you can sort of look forward to the future. But I think we're still today stuck in this, nations versus nations thing, and it's just like, I've heard people say the only thing that will unite us is an asteroid coming to Earth. And unfortunately, I think that's kind of right. I mean, maybe that's not the only thing, but I think something like that would unite us because it would affect us all. But hopefully, something that drastic doesn't need to happen for us to move past this idea of, nations, and this is my clan, and
Yeah,
understand.
I was thinking about that recently because you think of these rather global events that tend to bring people together, and they are usually rather traumatic. I'm thinking like in the case of like it's a more local example, but like 9/11 really like 9 September 12th was like everybody was everybody's best friend in America.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know what that impact was like internationally, but I would imagine there was still some sentiment of like just like empathy of like what these people experience and are going through, right?
Yeah, it
um
was. That was a global event for sure.
yeah, I mean, go to 2020 and COVID, and that was a huge trauma bonding experience for people, right? Especially like it was natural for us to be afraid,
Mm,
right? And afraid for maybe different reasons too. Like I'm afraid I'm going to get sick and die. I'm afraid I'm going to have my rights taken away from me, right? There's all these different fears that start to come up. But still, it was like really traumatic in the way that we were united. Then just recently, we had the solar eclipse.
right.
And I was just thinking how cool it was that like it was a positive event. It brought people together in really this unifying and uplifting way. And it's a natural event. It's
Hmm.
something that is built into this system that we are a part of in terms of the celestial system, right?
Mm,
And how it was a natural event that really, like called us to a greater sense of connectedness in that way. And it is a kind of thing where like, you can look at it from a scientific perspective, and that has its explanation. You
mm,
can go realms of astrology and the esoteric and all that, and they'll tell you what they want to tell you, right? Or then you can just kind of contemplate it in the sense of how you as an individual, take your upbringing and formation and, your beliefs and all that, and really kind of sit with it and not maybe reach a conclusion on it, but just, dwell on, the impact of that meaning. And maybe that starts to take you away from like, I don't know, upgrading your DNA or something like that, or some of these crazy things I'm hearing, or it's just the sun or the moon in front of the sun. It's nothing more
right.
than that, right? So like, maybe there is something deeper here to contemplate in terms of alignment, in terms of unity, in
Mm,
terms of shadow, in terms of pause, in terms of celebration. Right. I don't know that's not for me to tell someone. That's for them to go in and do that work.
hmm. Yeah, man. So I want to pivot here, and one of the things I find fascinating about Teilhard's work is the implications that it has for life on other planets. He even has an essay called "Life on Other Planets." What what can you say about that? Like from what you know about Teilhard's thoughts, and his evolutionary vision, what does that tell you about life on other planets?
Well, I think we have to start with omega, right? And if omega is omega, then it's going to be omega for me and for you and for any other little green men or Pleiadian or Draco or whatever race of extraterrestrial they claim to be out there, right?
Right.
The Greys, let's not forget about them, right? But it's the kind of thing that challenges us to take into account those fundamental concepts that we started with: consciousness, complexity.
Hmm.
Um, why would we presume that our carbon-based life form is the only form of, conscious life out there?
Hmm.
Um, why wouldn't we presume that, or why would we presume that life is to be found external of, our planet and on some other rock spinning through space when, an extraterrestrial might be something that is encountered through, an experience that one has through going deep into nature or something like that, right? I mean, this is something that's documented throughout folklore and wisdom tradition of all time of going into nature. Like you cited that example earlier of Jesus going into the desert, into the wilderness, and encountering these parts of himself. I'm not going to say that like that was an encounter with an extraterrestrial, but this is documented throughout time of people going into an unknown part of the world or part of themselves and discovering something unknown. So, I mean, like, on that, that's kind of like where Teilhard would stand in terms of like, God is God of all.
Hmm.
But for me, I kind of go beyond that and take a more Jungian perspective, where Jung kind of saw the UFO as a projection of the self, a
Hmm.
projection of the future self, something that really wasn't able, we were not able to fully grasp it and
Hmm.
conceptualize it and have something that we could model it off of and what it meant. It was sleek. It was almost seamless. There's, no form of joining or welding or bolting or anything like that on a lot of these crafts, and the way they move so fluidly and seem to defy gravity. Like, I would say that's a great metaphor for. I was just doing a conversation with a psychologist the other day for a podcast, and he was talking a lot about flow. That's a great metaphor for like flow, right? When we are in our flow state, when you're doing that thing you love or you have a great skill for or passion, you're going to do it in a way that, like, for some people who maybe aren't as into it or aren't as skilled as you, they're like, kind of looks like an alien in the way he's doing that.
Right. Hmm.
And that's kind of the way you saw it, was that the UFO is a projection of the self. And for me, I would say that, in some ways, maybe our encounters, now with UFOs are in some ways an encounter with our future selves in a way that have figured out how to transcend things like gravity, time, space, these laws that seem to inhibit us. Teilhard says that, when we have figured out mastered all of these laws. I'm sure you know the quote: the winds, the waves, and, the tides and gravity and all that. We will rediscover the power of love, or rekindle love, he says, and that will be our rediscovery of fire for a second time.
One of my
Um,
favorite
so
quotes.
yeah, and it's like kind of like, we may be entering into an age of titans. I mean, the things that science can do now, it's like a Jurassic Park type era we're entering in, and just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you better call Dr. Malcolm, the chaos mathematician, to come and, tell you how it's probably going to work out. Because life finds a way, like he says, But life finds a way for Teilhard too, whereby life unifies. Life brings us to a collective sense of being. It doesn't just continue to branch out into the realms of sci-fi, and that's what makes sci-fi so fun. And that's what makes Teilhard so fun, is because he kind of leaves some room for that, but he's always going to continuously bring us back to that point of center, which is that point of unified consciousness.
Right.
Say that, that's where you really want to be, and you need to do what you need to do to get there, no matter how hard that work is, because he was no stranger to hard work. He worked hard all his life. He suffered all his life. He was really inhibited most of his life from being able to share this vision in a
Hmm.
way that could get him peer review and that sort of academic respect.
Hmm.
But he still found a way to get it out there to lots of friends who were experienced in all sorts of fields and could give him critical feedback.
Hmm.
So, I mean, despite in his own example, despite all the challenges that were in front of him, he was still continually finding a way in a way that was unifying and wasn't taking him away from the church for that matter, I guess you could say. Like, despite all of the challenge and friction that he encountered because of the church, he still felt that's where he was being called to be as a human person at that time, because that what was also, despite it inhibiting him, it was this juxtaposition of it also enabling him to do this work, to do this study, to have this time to be able to process these thoughts. That's maybe something that's a luxury you don't have if you're not in religious life, is that convenience of your time, perhaps.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I remember when I was first reading Teilhard, I was doing my graduate degree, and I just couldn't believe how brave he was. Where he would go with his thought, knowing that he was a priest, a paleontologist, scientist and a priest, and just sort of knowing how people would feel about where he was going. But I found it fascinating with the law of complexity consciousness and the evolutionary process, how he would say that, look, we have so much evidence for this evolutionary process, this process of convergence, material complexity. We have actually millions and millions of years of evidence that this is
Yeah.
how evolution proceeds, that he says that we have to assume that this happens across the entirety of the universe, right? Because we have millions of years of evidence of it happening on Earth. And then sort of then once he accepts that, then he accepts that on other planets, when the conditions are right, the same force will be at play, this sort of movement of convergence of the material complexity of those worlds, and they will advance along the same trajectory that it did on Earth, of
Mhm.
material complexity and consciousness, where you'll have, maybe their version of the geosphere and then their version of the biosphere, which would mean, I think, different types of life than on Earth.
Yeah, right.
However, it would still be the material complexity and consciousness. So that's the similarity, that even though
Hmm.
life may look different, there'd be different species, that it
Hmm.
would still evolve along that process of complexity and consciousness. And then, of course, taking it a step further on those planets where that life finally crosses the critical threshold into self-consciousness. And then you
Right.
have, you have human-like beings on other planets, and I'm just like, wow, how can this guy write this? Like, that's fascinating, and yet I can't argue it. I'm like, that just seems right. And so whenever I think about, other life out there on other planets, it's and even actually, I've heard like NASA talk about this, and other people out there, whenever they talk about life on other planets, they always have the phrase material complexity with it. I
Mm.
just find that so fascinating. I'm like, yes, that's right. You cannot have life, you cannot have consciousness without the corresponding material complexity to it, right? And when you
Right.
think about that, when you try and think about life without material complexity, you can't even really do it. But yeah, so I mean, just where he would explore, it's just so fascinating. That guy, he's so
Yeah,
brave.
I mean, yeah, we could do like a podcast on this in and of itself, but you go into a lot of religious art, and there are some rather peculiar looking objects in a lot of religious art that seem to resemble some sort of craft in the sky or something like that. And
Right.
I think we just have to, consider that, like I said earlier, maybe these ecosystems of intelligences are existing in other realms that we aren't thinking to look, right? Like Jungian, for example, like Jung talks a lot about the collective unconscious and all the archetypes that reside in there. I don't know the person's name, but I remember like over a decade ago reading someone who was theorizing that maybe that ecosystem of archetypes are like an entire realm of intelligence and consciousness in and of itself that we can maybe more deeply encounter after we cross the or slip the mortal coil or something like that. I don't know, but those are some of the more speculative and fun thought experiments I like to do from time to time.
There was a nice essay in one of the books, those little pamphlets that they used to have at the American Teilhard Association. I guess they were like different pieces that scholars wrote, but there was a nice piece
Oh, right.
about the convergence between Carl Jung and Pierre Teilhard. And I read it years ago, so I can't really articulate what it was about. And it was before I really got into Carl Jung. So But I thought that was fascinating that someone out there saw a sort of convergence between their thought, and maybe one day we can chat about that. I got the book somewhere. We could sort of dig that up, and I'll probably do a reread of that. But because
That
I think
piece was
they were
probably by,
contemporaries.
I'm sorry?
They were contemporaries, right? I don't think they ever met, but they had similar lifespans, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that piece you're referencing was probably by Franklin Villas, who I think is still a member of the ATA, but I remember reading that one myself. Yeah. So yeah, Teilhard and Jung were contemporaries. They never met. They never had any correspondence, though there is anecdotal evidence that they had a knowledge of one another's work.
Hmm.
So I believe it's Jung who had a copy of Teilhard's Phenomenon of Man on his bedside and commented to his friend that it is a great work.
Hmm.
Um, and there's also a document, or there's some documentation of Teilhard writing about Jung to a friend, but his familiarity with him is kind of demonstrated in how he spells his name. He doesn't spell it correctly in it being Jung. He spells him Yung.
Hmm.
Um, so for whatever, we want to speculate on that. But yeah, so no correspondence, but I mean, and just the understanding of how we've already established consciousness works, right? There is a collective component to it. So it's no surprise that they were kind of uh, touching on similar themes and threads that are moving through this way where Teilhard is concerned, Jung's looking like more of kind of like the soul and like the soul, how do we focus on the salvation of the soul, individuation, the emergence of the self, that whole thing. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Teilhard is more focused on the soul in relationship to the spirit of all that connects us, and for that matter the world too. So yeah, I mean, even in the future of man, he kind of speculates a bit on the end of the world and what that might look like.
Hmm.
And it's really this kind of great mystical transformation that he says kind of looks like it's the end of life on Earth, but it's actually a great transformation into a higher form of being.
You're right. He does say that.
Yeah.
And it's that point I often think about Christ's death and resurrection, that it looks like a death, but it's actually a transition to life. Huh? It's kind of scary to think about, that if
Well, yeah, and even earlier you were talking about rocks, and I'm thinking about how like you take dead or decaying matter, like a dead log or something like that, or even like an animal dies or is killed in the wilderness or something, and within hours there's going to be maybe even minutes, I don't know. There's all sorts of bacteria and fungi that start working their way, beetles and decomposers, worms, to start breaking that piece of dead or decaying matter down. And in that, there is more life
yeah,
than there was in the living organism itself. Right? All of
fascinating.
a sudden, this animal carcass or this piece of wood is a home to all this, entire ecosystem of organisms.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, what one of the pushbacks I've always gotten with Teilhard from theologians now is original sin,
Okay.
right? And the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden, and
Hmm.
there's a sort of tendency to want to make that a literal, and if not literal, still real idea that there was a peaceful creation at the very beginning, a garden, everything was well ordered, and that it was actually sin was introduced into the world, decay and destruction was introduced in the world through this symbolic interpretation of Adam and Eve eating from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. And so it was the fault of the human that brought destruction and death and sin into God's ordered world. And and then of course Taylor's interpretation, of course, we know he believes in evolution and that there was not a literal Garden of Eden, according to him, where Adam and Eve existed, and there was not sort of this from his perspective a world, an original world where there was, peace and prosperity. Um, how do we square those two things then? Because the theologians always push back on that. Even some of my Jesuit priests who taught me, that was something that they couldn't quite figure out with Teilhard. How have you sort of, normalized that for yourself?
So in terms of original sin, and yeah, I mean, well, just to give some background to the listeners, for anyone that's into this kind of thing, he was basically just writing some journal notes to himself in a personal journal, close it, put it in a desk, and then somehow it was just open to that page, and his superior was made aware of it, and one thing led to another, and he gets the reprimand for it. But
Right.
right, he's questioning how it could be possible that's just this one couple from which the rest of humanity, no, scientifically that couldn't make sense. So really it's this matter of seeing creation that's still in progress and incomplete.
Hmm.
And that kind of shifts our perspective on sin, but not only sin, but also God too, because then it's not like God is this figure in the sky waving a figure saying you did the wrong thing or you messed up or shame on you or I'll smite you, right? But rather a loving God that's understanding, forgiving, kind, compassionate, along with walking along with us on the journey, willing to hold us when we need being held. That footsteps prayer, right?
Right.
So it's that kind of thing where we move to a much more loving God that Jesus refers to as Abba, as Father, not like this great sky deity that punishes, right? But I think that's kind of where he's going with that.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think, even Christ he kind of, I feel like he almost pushes back on the narrative of that 7-day creation when he
Hmm.
says, "My father is at work till now, and so am
Hmm.
I." Whereas when you go back to Genesis, wait, I thought God actually finished already and he's resting now, right? So it's
Yeah.
like even Christ himself was kind of saying, no, actually he's still working. And so I think even for Christ and I think for Teilhard, we're still in that 6th day. And that seventh
Right.
day hasn't arrived yet. God is still creating through the evolutionary process. He's drawing us all upwards towards him and the whole universe towards him. And we haven't reached that 7th day where there's rest or heaven or mega point or whatever it is that we want to call it. And I just
Right.
find
And
it.
we get that. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say we get that story from the book of Genesis, right? And for Teilhard, it's incorrect to say that we live in a cosmos or we are a cosmos. It is correct to say that we live in a cosmogenesis. We
Hmm.
are still in the process of evolving, of becoming whole, and we don't know what the end looks like yet to say that we have lived in the cosmos, right?
Yeah, I I did my master's thesis on Taylor too, and I can't even remember really what it was about, but I remember the conclusion sort of being that Taylor is a modern day logos theology. And I remember in school we
Yeah.
would learn about, what I found fascinating with the early church fathers,
Hmm.
300s, 400s, 200s, is that they had this cosmic vision of the world that's
Right.
very similar to Taylor's, and so many of them also interpreted that 7-day creation story as not 7 literal days, but as this sort of vast, lengthy process, and Christ not being not just a historical figure, but a huge cosmic omega figure. I mean, I have even back here John Chrysostom's The Cosmic Mystery of Christ, and
Hmm.
I think that there was along the way in the history of Christianity, there was a sort of transition from this cosmic understanding of the events of Christianity towards, I don't know, more of a literal dogmatic, you know, uh, simplified explanation of things. But I think with Taylor, he sort of
Yeah.
like re-enlarged it again. I just find that fascinating that he was able to close that gap.
I think it's very interesting because yes, he was much more fond of the Eastern fathers rather than the fathers who were writing in Latin.
Mm,
And for that matter, I was just having this conversation with my wife yesterday. It's funny, just talking. So weird, we're part of the Roman Catholic Church in good standing and all that. Just like talking with her about a friend, Orthodox faith, and just like it's like they are what the Catholic Church wants to be or
mm,
should be, like, in that way.
mhm,
Um, and it's really looking at it from, a very critical, I will admit, perspective as a theologian. I've worked in theology and ministry my whole adult life. So is my wife. So, we have some biases and opinions, but a lot of experience to go with it too. And it's just very unique, some of those differences. And I think a lot of that is um, how the practice makes room for the movement of the spirit. And the movement of the spirit a lot of times is going to challenge the institutional structure or the integrity of an institutional structure. And I think that we saw that happen with particularly the Roman Catholic Church, and a lot of its many of its problems have been aired out today. And it's obviously not a perfect institution, but it's just to say that, like, no institution is perfect for that matter, but it's just to say that, like, when I think that something intrinsic, as intrinsic as like faith, spirituality, starts to become institutionalized for the sake of power, then we're in quite a predicament here. It's a very slippery slope in
Right.
terms of really looking at things like authenticity. And it's no wonder why they silenced Teilhard,
Yeah.
right? Because what he was really preaching was the message that would become foundational for the Second Vatican Council,
Mm-hmm.
that there is a universal call to holiness, that all people are called to that, and that it's not just these guys with collars on,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right? Like it.
it's funny because like I remember when I went to graduate school, nobody knew Teilhard. None of my theologian friends, yeah, they knew him, but they never really read him. And I was like, trying to figure my way through there. And then when we start studying the Second Vatican, I'm like, this is all Teilhardian. Like, like obviously he influenced the Second Vatican Council so much. And I'm like, wow, okay, this guy had a little bit more influence than I realized, and maybe other people even realize. So it's
And I mean,
funny.
just to show you how slow the church moves, okay, that's back in the 60s. Now we're finally in, I don't know what year it was released, but Laudato Si, it was probably like 2016 or something like that. Laudato Si, the
What's
encyclical
that?
on the environment that the Pope wrote, came out. And that's where he actually cites Teilhard.
Right, right,
So
right.
it's like, well, it took you all these years later, like 40, 50 years later, to
Yeah,
finally get
yeah,
down to dropping the guy's name.
yeah.
Like, yeah, because he was heavily influential on Vatican II, especially on people like Karl Rahner and Henri de Lubac, who were
Right,
a part of the council themselves.
right.
Um, but yeah, it's bureaucracy, man.
Yeah, I remember reading Ranner. We had to read a lot of Ranner, and he was definitely influenced by Teilhard. Even in his big book, whatever it's called, I got it somewhere. He mentions Teilhard like in chapter one. But
Mhm.
like, yeah, I always felt like he was the sort of systematic theologian of Teilhard's sort of grand vision. Um,
Yeah.
and but yeah, no, I find it interesting that both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have mentioned Teilhard. All right, so that's pretty cool, pretty cool. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think, before we sort of end here, I'm kind of curious as to what you're doing over there in Pennsylvania at the monastery, especially in terms of Teilhard. Like, in terms of you, I assume that maybe you're teaching Teilhard, or actually, I don't really know what you're doing, but what I want to ask is, what is the reception like? Or first of all, what are you actually doing? Are you teaching Teilhard? Are you teaching his theology? Are you teaching more of a mystical and spiritual approach to his vision? And how do the monks, and please tell me what type of monastery it is, which
Mhm.
order, how do they respond to, what you say about Teilhard?
Sure. So I am in the very fortunate circumstance to be the director of the Spirituality and Retreat Center at Daylesford Abbey, which is an abbey similar to our monastery. We're just outside of the Philadelphia area, and it is a home to a community of Norbertine priests. So I think there's 18 priests who currently live here, and they're not
Saint
considered
Norbert?
monks. Saint Norbert, yeah. So Saint Norbert
Interesting.
was the founder of the Order of Premonstratensians, which are more commonly known as Norbertines.
Right.
Um, yeah, there's the priests that live here. They're not monks. They're considered canons regular, which means that they live in community and pray in community together. They chant the daily office in the morning and afternoon,
Mm.
but their ministries take them outside of the abbey to
Mm.
parishes, hospitals, high schools, colleges, things like that. So
Okay.
it is primarily an aging community. The majority of the members here are retired. So there are just a few that are active in ministry, but the main ministry of the Abbey right now is the Spirituality Center, just in terms of numbers and how busy we are with welcoming groups. So, I am not leading every retreat that comes in here. That doesn't really pay the bills well that way, nor make time for me to do my other aspects of my job. But I do intentionally lead retreats and programs that either very explicitly focus on Teilhard or in some way incorporate his thought. So, I mean, I've done everything from just like, kind of more academic sessions where we meet weekly on Wednesday nights and we go through his thought in terms of like, going through all the different elements of complexity consciousness, within, without, defining these terms, looking at the models of geosphere, biosphere, all that, to
Mhm.
getting into the more mystical aspects of some of his writings, contemplation on some of his prayers, stuff like that. And he's like easy to work in with a lot of stuff. So we did a feast day for St. Francis of Assisi program back in October, and able to incorporate a lot of Teilhard in Francis's contemplation of the natural imagery of the world. St. Francis is known for being a saint very in union with the world and animals and stuff like that. So naturally, a lot of Teilhard's prayers and stuff can be used. Um, and then we're actually going to be using the Abbey for a host site this coming June for the annual event of the American Teilhard Association. So it's going to be an in-person retreat. We're going to meet from May 31st through June 2nd. We're going to have a presentation from John Philip Newell, who is a very seasoned writer and teacher on Celtic spirituality. He's recently written a book that featured Teilhard in one of the chapters called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. So we're going to be having that event here. So it's really been neat in the experience that I've had in working with Teilhard, from doing workshops. I've done a lot of stuff with like Center for Christogenesis. That's Ilia Delio's organization. She's a more popular writer on Teilhard. I've been very blessed to be able to work with Sister Kathleen Duffy, who's the president of the American Teilhard Association. And just all of the awesome people, especially through the ATA, have just, really come together to make a great effort that way. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like you get contacted by people, word of mouth spreads. Oh, I hear you did a program on Teilhard for this group. Would you be willing to speak to our group? So I've spoken to Protestant churches recently. I recently spoke to like a senior community. It was this very active senior community, and that was one of the best presentations I've ever done. And it really wasn't because of my material. It was really because of their questions. And like they're very with it. They're a very active, engaged senior community doing lots of community service, stuff like that. And their questions were just so good. There were questions, just they transcended the boundaries of the containers of religion that we can just so easily keep ourselves in, because we
Mhm.
want to be good little boys and girls of faith, right? We don't want to question things and buck the system. But
Mhm.
their questions were like in line with our conversation today. They were asking about extraterrestrial life and all this stuff. And we were really like just stretching these muscles out of where this thought could go. So yeah, and then I do more intimate retreats here at the Abbey where, a group will, maybe just focus on a niche topic. Like I did one last year where we focused on Teilhard's Mass of the World, and we met over the course of a few days here. And, people have the time to enjoy the Abbey and go to chanted prayer with the Norbertines and just enjoy the beauty of the grounds we're on here. So yeah, and I mean, like now, like my focus has kind of shifted to, not shifted, but expanded rather, to the earth, where it's like, how can I live and embody these instrumental parts of Teilhard's vision and this larger vision in my conscious interaction with the complexity of the planet. So over the last few years, my family and I have really gotten into gardening. I've gotten really into gardening. My family
Mhm.
just kind of comes along for the ride. The kids learn. My wife's just like, okay, what did you harvest today? She's happy for the fresh food. But
Yeah.
like integrating chickens and things like that, looking for more, like I said earlier with permaculture, these more living and self-sustainable systems that allow for a greater awareness of how we're connected, really, honestly. Um, so
Got
yeah, I mean that's like the work that I'm doing. I do some publishing too. I haven't published in a minute. It's been a couple of years since I've put anything out in writing that way, but podcasting has kind of been the shift. Doing the podcast for the American Teilhard Association. I was doing a podcast for a while too for the Abbey, and I'm thinking about maybe just kind of starting my own thing soon. That's maybe affiliated with the ATA, but conversation can kind of go beyond Teilhard and touch into more realms of like convergence and culture, and keep it within that vein, but kind of make it broader so that maybe we can get more people interested in Teilhard or something, is my thought. Like
Yeah.
conversations on complexity, convergence, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, he's present in all of those conversations without explicitly
Right.
talking about him.
And truthfully, I don't like talking about, I love talking about them all the time, but I don't like talking about them all the time. Like I want to talk about other things with other people. I don't want to be just that guy in the room that's Teilhard, Teilhard, Teilhard. And if that's what people want, that's fine. But, you know, I want to hear more about how other people connect. You know, you asked what I'm doing. One of the things I've done a few times over this past year that's been really awesome and very interactive is I've been doing these book studies where they're free. We meet on Zoom. I basically just pick the book that I want to read or reread. And I'm like, hey, this is when we're going to meet. We're going to meet for so many sessions. And and the way I do it is like, I'm not going to guide you. I want to know what you're thinking about this. I have some things I might want to talk about,
Right.
but just to get other people's insight and wisdom and to get like them share how they relate and they connect this stuff to their life. So many light bulbs go off for me where it shows you how the collective is so powerful and influencing your own consciousness back, where you're like, I would have never thought of that stuff if
Mhm.
I had never had this conversation with these people. And thankfully we're all talking about tarot, so it's, you know, it's fair game that way, but you do want to get other people's sense of experience too.
Definitely, man. I've seen some of your stuff on Instagram, some of the stuff you're talking about. So we'll definitely put all of your links in the YouTube description so people can see what you're up to. They can see about the next session that the American Tailor Association is having over there at the monastery, and you know all those other projects that you're up to. But I'd like to say thanks a lot. It's great to talk about Teilhard. You know, I was the guy who was always just talking about Teilhard, Teilhard, Teilhard. So many of my friends have heard about Teilhard, right? So I was that obnoxious guy, and it's you know, it's I've always sort of yearned to speak, to really geek out on some of his work. So I really appreciate you, you know, meeting me and discussing Teilhard, and hopefully people, you know, get some value from it and investigate him on their own.
Likewise, Badir, thank you. Yeah, this has been great. I'm glad we were able to finally connect. I mean, people should know we met online. So, like, you know, they say don't meet people on the internet, right? It's like I have met so many cool Teilhard people online.
Right.
I think like you just got to look in the right areas to
It's
meet the
true. I
right
mean,
people.
it's the only place I've been able to find people into Teilhard is online. You know, I haven't found them. Actually, no, there is one guy, another filmmaker, director I've met who's read Teilhard. So that was interesting. But thanks a lot. It was great to chat, and
Thanks, man.
let's do it again sometime.
For sure. Thanks, Badir.